that you as students give to this campus. I like to tell people it's a two-way street. I hope we benefit you at least a little, but I know you benefit us a lot, and so thank you. John Stott wrote in The Contemporary Christian that not long before she died in 1988, in a moment of surprising candor, Margarita Lasky, one of the best-known secular humanists and novelists, said this: "What I envy most about you Christians is your forgiveness. I have nobody to forgive me." We read about forgiveness from God in Ephesians chapter 2, quite an incredible story and description of God's forgiveness, a forgiveness that comes not from anything that you or I have done, can do, but just because of His grace, His kindness, and His love. He forgives us who had no hope, brings us into His presence, and loves us when we don't deserve it. And He lets us love Him back and live for Him. It's a great read. You ought to try it. But that's not where we're going today. I want to direct your attention to Matthew chapter 18. Beginning with verse 21, Matthew 18, beginning with verse 21. And I'll be reading out of the ESV. Let's hear the word of the Lord. "Then Peter came up and said to Him, 'Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?' Jesus said to him, 'I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But then that same servant went out. He found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, 'Pay what you owe.' So this fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' He refused, and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you?' And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother from your heart." In Colossians 3:13, "Bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive." But forgiveness for most of us, or many of us, can be a challenge, maybe more so for some than others. And this morning I'm using a very personal, tragic event in the life of my own family that took me on a journey of learning to forgive. I'm not preaching this because I was so good at it. I'm actually preaching it to let you get some help because I wasn't so good at it. But I'm very grateful for the journey that God took me to the place of freedom by forgiveness. You know, it was a long time ago now, 1977. You didn't even know that time period existed, but it did. And yes, I was alive then. And what's interesting is right before all of this happened, I was thinking about our family. Now, our family, we had our problems, and we were not initially a Christian family. But overall, I was thinking, God's been good to us. We've had no tragedies. I wonder what it would be like. Now, I don't know if this was God preparing me or just my morbid paranoia. But I was thinking, what if I lost one of my loved ones? And then we had Labor Day, and late that night, in the middle of the night, I received one of those phone calls that you never want to get. I was living in Chattanooga. Brenda and I were in Chattanooga. We were teaching at a Christian school, and my dad called. And he said, Jimmy's gone. I don't know if it was my sleepiness or shock or what. I said, what do you mean gone? And he said, he's dead. And I said something really silly as I look back, but again, I don't know if it was the shock or the sleepiness. I said, you're kidding. And he said, would I kid you about this? And I just remember being pretty speechless. Wasn't much to say. And that few short hours till morning were seemingly quite long. And my oldest brother called me and he said, look, just get up here, get on a plane, I'll make sure it's covered. And we flew from Chattanooga to Pittsburgh, and I came into Pittsburgh, and my grandparents and my uncle picked me up, and I can still remember just, what do you say? And we didn't say much. And on the way home, which was about an hour drive, I finally started to ask questions. I mean, what do you know? What happened? And at this point, I had no clue. And he said, well, they found him lying beside the car between Mercer and Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and we don't know. Said maybe, they were speculating maybe he was diabetic and we didn't know it, something happened, we didn't have a clue. And then we got home, and I remember looking at the house, knowing that I needed to walk in there and face my parents and my brothers, and once again it was pretty silent, nothing to say. And there was a lot of early confusion about what was going on. All we knew, again, was that he was lying beside the car. And then a police officer came by, and my oldest brother was a point person, and he talked to him, and he came back in and said, it looks like it might have been a hit and run. And so that, of course, was upsetting. And then another police officer came, and my brother went back to the backyard and talked with him, and I could tell something was not good at all. And he came back and he said it was no accident. They're pretty certain he was murdered. And to us, it's like, that can't happen. I've known some families where something like that you might think could happen. I've ministered to a lot of people, and I've dealt with some who, one in particular that was murdered, and that's the lifestyle he chose, and it was either him or somebody else. But that wasn't us. And that wasn't Jimmy. And it was like, this couldn't have happened. Well, the story unfolded, and we finally found out what did happen. He had dropped his girlfriend off and headed home, and a man who was interested, a man who was married with children, but had told the girlfriend that he was single and that he couldn't live without her, and he wanted her in a relationship with him instead of Jim. And he bought a blue flashing police light, followed him on the country road, pulled him over, got him out of the car with a shotgun, beat him with a piece of axle, drove over him twice in order to make it look like a hit and run. And Jim was found lying on the side of the road by a lady that lived there and wondered why that car was parked out there and called the police. One of the guys that was driving the ambulance was a friend of Jim's, and he recognized him. And the police tried to comfort my mother, saying, he died instantly, but he was alive when his friend picked him up. But he said he probably violated all the rules he was supposed to get him to the hospital, but it was too late. And so I listened to that story, and I went to that courtroom, and I heard this played out again as David Hanna made his confession as to how he did this and why. And I struggled. And I a sense of justice kicked in. That's the best word I can put on it. It would have been nice if forgiveness would have instantly kicked in. It has for some people. It did for my mother. It didn't for me. This was my little brother, the peaceful, mild-natured one. You know, any of us would have made more sense than Jimmy. He was just that kind of guy. Friendly, laid back. You know, my oldest brother, he had his scraps. My next oldest brother, I used to say he lived to fight. He didn't care if he won or lost. He just would fight. And me, I was built more for running than fighting, but, you know, it was kind of, you went with the turf when I was a kid, so you had to do some. And, but not Jim. He was the peaceful guy. He was 20 years old. Through a co-op program, he already was managing the Revco pharmacy store in our town. And his employees came to comfort us and offer their condolences, and we're talking about how excited Jimmy was the last time they talked to him. He came to work and he said, "Guess what? I'm going to be an uncle." Brenda and I just found out that we were going to have our first child, and he was so excited. Then I realized he wouldn't be an uncle. He'd never know Brent or any of our kids. This was it. And I fell in love with the Old Testament principle of the next of kin being the one to bring justice. I would lie in my bed at night and I would think about it. I'm not proud of that, but that's what I did. And justice is a virtue of God, too, by the way. But it's a whole lot safer in His hands than it was in mine. And so I would dream about that and think, oh, if I could just... And that went on a good while. My dad became very bitter. His family found it very easy to be bitter. It was an awful, awful family. And my dad was affected by it. He came out of it in marvelous ways, but he was still affected by it. They knew how to hold grudges and kind of got passed on to me, I'm afraid. Matter of fact, the last thing I had to do to deal with, my last struggle before becoming a Christian, was I had been, talked about fighting back then. It was kind of part of our culture, I guess. There was a guy from another school and a few guys from that school that saw I was from the wrong school, and they decided to do a little punching on my face, and which I seriously didn't appreciate. But anyway, and by the way, my brother that I said always loved to fight, he looked at me when he saw me. He said, "What happened to you?" I said, "Oh, a bunch of guys from Union jumped me over there." He said, "What'd you do?" I said, "I left." He said, "You what? No brother of mine's ever going to walk away from a fight." I said, "Oh, yes, there's one of your brothers going to walk away from a fight. There were 6 of them. I'm not stupid." He wouldn't have walked away from it, I promise you. He would not. But I fell into this thing. I found out who the guy was that was kind of leading the gang. I said, I'm going to get him. I worked for probably 2 or 3 months trying to be where he was. I probably would have gotten whipped again. But, you know, a grudge. We were good at it. Hatfields and McCoys aren't the only ones that can do that. We were pretty good at it. My dad would say, "How can I love a God who allowed this to happen to my son?" And I would try to talk to him. One day I went in and he looked very thoughtful and quiet, and I said, "What's up, Dad?" He said, "Well, I just had something happen. I'm not sure how to respond to it." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, I was telling Julianne, that's my sister-in-law, and that I can't love a God who allowed this to happen to my son." And she looked at me and said, "Well, Dad, I think God knows something about losing a son. He lost his only one. You have 3 left." And Dad said, "What do I say to that?" I was just thinking, way to go, Julianne. And I remember saying to him, actually, before that conversation ended, I said, go ahead, Dad. Turn your back on God. Nobody can stop you. Go ahead. Go ahead. And, of course, he's looking at me very puzzled because I'm the rescuer in the family, always trying to fix everything. Go ahead. And we just looked at each other a while. I said, now what do you have? You still lost your son. What do you have? But then there was my mother. Now, if there's anybody that should have been preaching this sermon, it should be her. She reached out to the murderer's wife and her children, constantly trying to find out what they needed, if they needed any help. She had to do that behind my dad's back because he wouldn't allow it. She got cancer shortly after this, which my dad blamed on the trauma of this. My son also had to have surgery when he was born and was 3 weeks old. He blamed that on this too. Who knows? But he said to her, the wife worked at the hospital where my mother would be, and she worked on that same floor, and he would tell the hospital, do not let that woman in this room. You better not let that woman in this room. And she actually did walk in one time, and he ran her out. When he wasn't there, my mother would call her in and ask her how she was doing, and if she needed anything, and if she could pray for her. And Mother had prayed. She had become a Christian in her middle years, and I've never seen anybody grow as rapidly as she did. She devoured everything about God she could. She read books like you can't believe. She prayed, amazing. And she grew, and she was praying then for a family to be saved at any cost. And she looked me in the eye and said, I don't know. And this was a broken-hearted mother, as only a mother can grieve. She was grieving. Trust me. She wasn't flippant. But she said, if this is what it takes, then what can I say? Well, back to Jimmy, or rather his killer. I viewed him as very cocky and arrogant. He would stride into that courtroom, and now maybe I wouldn't project anything good on him. Okay, you understand that? But he just looked like a cocky, arrogant person who would come in, stop, and kiss his wife on the way into the courtroom. And my skepticism, I said, yeah, right. You're playing to the jury. But, you know, many tragic wrongs can never be reversed. And they have far-reaching consequences. My brother would never marry. He'd never know our children. But there's a whole lot of other reversible or irreversible things. Murder is definitely one of them. But what about the desecration of one's person that results from rape, molestation, stealing of one's innocence, the betrayal of people that one should most be able to trust, sometimes even parents? These things can crush one's ability to believe in and to relate to others. And there's other wrongs that are reversible, but they leave lifelong wounds, and too many know the pain inflicted by condescending words and condemning words and actions. Betrayal and wrongs come in different modes and packages, but they all hurt. They can't be forgotten. They must be forgiven. You know, not only do we struggle to forgive, many of us find it almost impossible to accept forgiveness. We feel like we cannot accept forgiveness because we don't deserve it. What we did simply can't be forgiven. That's not what God says. I believe my dad struggled on both ends of this. He struggled to forgive, but he couldn't accept forgiveness either. He dealt with that nearly to his dying day. I had a friend, Calvin, who struggled to accept forgiveness, and he told me a story one time about all the things of his past, and it was a lot to overcome. He said, I just can't accept forgiveness. And he was in despair, and he got a Euro pass to travel by rail throughout Europe, and he ended up in Haarlem, Netherlands, and he said, I read that book by Corrie ten Boom, The Hiding Place. I wonder if the clock shop is still around. And so he went out walking around and found it. And he walked in and got talking to the lady that was working in there, and he said, is Miss ten Boom around? And she said, no, she's ill today. She said, please sign the guest book. And he made a note, and I don't know what he said. He didn't tell me. But he made a note in the guest book there, and the lady went over and read it, and then she turned and said to him, as he was about to leave, she said, sir, come back here tomorrow. He said, why? I said, just come back. Well, he went back the next day, and as he walked in, the lady said, Miss Ten Boom is still not feeling well, but she's in the back room lying down, and she would like to see you. And Calvin told me that he went through his story of unforgiveness. And, you know, Corrie Ten Boom could talk about forgiveness, if you're familiar. And he just said, I just can't. And she said to him, Calvin, hand me that book over there. And he said he got the book, and he handed it over to her, and she wouldn't take it. He said it got really awkward. And it's like, what do I do now? And finally, she reached out and she took it, and she said, now look at there, Calvin. When somebody offers you a gift, just take it. And Calvin prayed through that day. And his words, I prayed through crying in Corrie Ten Boom's lap. And they remained friends for the rest of her life. So why is it so hard to forgive? Let me suggest some things. First of all, the pain is so intense. I know that I should forgive because that's what the Bible tells me. And I pray and I ask God, but it just doesn't seem to be working. Why? Why is it so hard? It's hard because the pain is so intense it overwhelms our thinking. You know, it's like when you get hurt playing ball or something. I used to go down to the gym a lot more than the old guy goes down there now, but I used to see sometimes when somebody seriously sprained their ankle and they'd start screaming and rolling around on the floor, all kinds of terrible contortions, not thinking about all the people watching them. What's the deal? They're consumed with the pain. That's what happens with us. We're consumed with the pain. Human nature defends itself. Think about, maybe you're in the ball field or out at a picnic and you're standing off close to the field and all of a sudden somebody yells, look out! And you catch a little shadow coming your way and you hunker down, you're going to protect yourself. Well, it's hard to forgive because it feels like we need to hold on to this because it feels protecting. We try to protect ourselves from the emotional pain like we do physical pain. It's a natural fight or flight thing as well. Plus, I think it's because unforgiveness is easy to justify, at least in our own heads. I mean, seriously now, let's be logical. I could have this conversation, at least I did, especially back then. Why should I forgive this guy that killed my brother? Give me one good reason. He deserves justice. He deserves the death penalty. I see no logic in that. He brutally killed my brother, traumatized my family. I watched my parents suffer like only parents can when they lose a child. No, this guy deserves justice, not forgiveness. And the logic's the same with those other irreversible sins that are inflicted upon people. It's easy to conclude that unforgiveness is logical and even right. After all, right is right and wrong is wrong, right? We justify unforgiveness because we think that forgiving the perpetrator betrays the victim. I am fully confident that was my dad's struggle. He felt like if he forgave his son's murderer, it was being disloyal to his loved one. But what is forgiveness? It's kind of hard to deal with it if we don't even know what it is. Forgiveness is not. Let's look first of all what it's not. It's not an emotion. I still hurt when I think of Jimmy's death. In fact, when I was back in Pennsylvania a week before Christmas this year, my oldest brother Robert gave me some newspaper articles that I had never seen before. 40 plus years later, I had some emotions. I felt. I still hate it when my mind returns to that courtroom and replays the scene of that man that's there. I can remember the dread when we thought that he was going to be let out on parole. He wasn't. They say he won't be. I don't know. He did get a life sentence. And it's difficult to label the emotion I feel when I think of the painful way and unnecessary death that Jimmy suffered because of this man. So can I forgive and still feel pain? Maybe even anger? Yes, forgiveness helps, but it doesn't guarantee the removal of all of our emotions. I had an aunt that tried to convince my mother during that time, and I think well-intentioned, and I don't blame her, that my mother should take something to help ease what she was feeling. And I'm not against that, okay? Please do not read that into my statement. I'm very pragmatic about medicine. But she was trying to get my mother to take something, and my mother came to me and she told me that one of the aunts was trying to convince her that she should take something to calm her nerves, make her feel better. And she looked at me, and I've never forgotten this statement. And she said, "Does God not want me to feel?" And I thought, God probably does. It's me that doesn't want to. Emotions are not bad. Now, I grew up being told not to express emotion. I was taught that very strongly. Guys don't cry. Guys don't show. Now, if it's anger, that's an okay masculine emotion, but nothing else was allowed. I am quite an emotional person, but even now I struggle often to show it. It's been so drilled in me. My dad lived in a lot of denial. I don't know if that came out of this incident or not, but when I went to see my mother, I didn't know she was as bad as she was. She was dying of cancer. My dad kept telling me everything was okay. My oldest brother called and he said, "Why aren't you here?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Mom's nearly dead." I said, "I had no idea." And I walked in and saw her and couldn't believe how bad she was, and I started to cry. And I got that look from my dad with a finger pointing out the door. Take it out. But you know what I've learned about emotions? I don't know what spectrum you're on. We're all over the map in this chapel. Emotions connect you with life. The best and, yes, the worst. But you're connected to life. Just don't let them control you all the time. But forgiveness is a choice. Forgiveness chooses to forfeit what we think is rightfully ours. Forgiveness treats someone better than they deserve. I like to define forgiveness as releasing someone from a penalty that they deserve. Doesn't mean they don't deserve it. Just like I deserve a penalty, and Jesus Christ set me free. And I don't deserve it one bit. And guess who I'm supposed to forgive like? Jesus. We saw that in the story of the debtor and those that were forgiven. And, it's easy to justify, it's truth. I deserve to be in hell. You do too. I deserve to be punished for my sin, but I don't want to be. So why should I think that David Hanna should be? I actually do think he should face justice, okay? I was glad for the verdict, okay? But, I can start, my sin's not that bad. No, we can't go there. We need to choose. There was a story in the Last Years by Charles Braceland Flood when after the war a Kentucky woman showed him a tree that was seriously damaged by the federal artillery, and she looked at Lee for some kind of words to condemn the North, and he looked at her and said, "Cut it down, dear madam, and forget it." Just like we have to choose to love, we have to choose to forgive. Now, maybe forgetting it was the wrong expression, but I think you get it. So, quickly, what principles lead to forgiveness? The principle of substitution. That happened in the Old Testament. Scapegoat. The blood of the sacrifices were on our behalf. We didn't deserve it. They were our substitute, Jesus. is our substitute. And when I couldn't figure out how to forgive, and I was still laying there at nights thinking about what I'd like to do, one night I was praying, and I believe the Lord led me to this. I always prayed for my family in a certain order. You know, always the parents, oldest brother, next brother, and then there was Jimmy. What did I do when I got there? And I think the Lord directed me to do one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. Instead of praying for Jimmy, I started praying for David Hanna, his murderer. I'm going to tell you, almost instantly, if not instantly, I saw David Hanna completely different. He was a man that Jesus died for just like he died for me. He was a man that was lost and headed to hell, and the best thing that could happen to the Miles family wasn't for David Hanna to get the death penalty. It was for David Hanna to become a brother in Christ. That was my principle of substitution. And there's also the principle of authority. We're not the ones to bring the justice. The civil authorities are. It protects you and the offender. I also say there's a 70 times 7 principle that we read here. It's a great math formula of the Bible. I interpret it as 70 times 7, no matter how many times you still forgive another time. And the principle of investment, Romans 12 and 13, invest in somebody. Invest good in people that hate you and treat you bad. That's what God says. And that's what God does. Matthew 6 tells us that. Romans 13, don't owe no man anything but love. Treat them good no matter how they treat you. And when you invest in something, I have a feeling that you value them more, even if it's your enemy. When you invest in people, you can start the road to loving them again. Yeah, I've had a lot of journeys on this. I didn't learn everything at once. I can remember a guy stole a car from me, supposedly a good friend of mine. I tell you, how would you like to have a friend like that? Choose your friends better than I do. He did. He said, I want your car. And he said he was, and I said, okay. I said, I'll charge you this much. He said, well, I don't have the money. I said, okay, I'll charge you this much more. And you pay me later. And we set a time, and he never did. And he left the state with my car. And no money. And then somebody told me, he said, hey, I heard he's back in town. I said, good, I've still got a set of keys. So I went and I stole my car back. And I knew he was going to come after it, and I disabled it. He just came in the middle of the night trying to get it, and of course it wouldn't start, and I heard him out there, and we had a conversation. And dumb me, honestly, I did this. I looked at him. He said, look, I'll pay you. I said, the deal was you pay this much. I got the new tires, and you put other tires on it. And I honestly let him take the car again. I know. Don't be so judgmental. Be pitiful toward me, okay? Pity me. And, of course, he did the same thing. And so what did I do? I kicked into justice mode. Right is right, wrong is wrong, this is wrong. And I told him, by the way, and I should not have done this. I apologize for this to you. I called him by name and I said, I will get that money. And so I said I would get it. And so I went out there to him. And I said, I found out where he's working. I went to him and he got ready for me. I could tell he was expecting us to have a bit of a confrontation. But in the meantime, the Lord was speaking to me and said, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. I tried every way I could to get around that. I can get pretty logical. Not always truthful, but logical. And I finally said, okay, Lord, it's in your hands. And I went to the guy and I said, I know why you think I'm here. Calm down. I meant what I said, but I'm turning you over to God. I said, God can take care of this for me. and I'm just leaving you in his hands. He was a whole lot more afraid of God than he was me, and rightfully so. I got my money and the tires, and he wanted me to pray with him before I left. Well, I tell you what, forgiveness is a tough thing, and a lot of times we think just because we've forgiven, we don't feel. That can be an evidence that you need to think about, but that is not in and of itself evidence that you've not forgiven. So don't reject God's freedom. Okay? Let me close with this illustration. There was some missionaries went to Canada, Alberta, Canada, and they were seriously opposed by the Cree Indian chief, Muscatpatoon. He was very violent toward them, but he became a Christian. Shortly after he became a Christian, his father was murdered by a chief from another tribe, the Blackfoot tribe, a member of the Blackfoot tribe. Muscatpatoon rode into the camp and listened to what he did. He said, he confronted him and said, "You killed my father, so now you must be my father. You shall ride my best horse and wear my best clothes." And he gave them to him as a gift. In amazement and remorse, the murderer replied, "My son, now you have killed me." His own hatred had been slain by the man's forgiveness. Now, that's not always going to happen. But that's not in our hands. Our hands is to forgive as Jesus forgave. We live in a world that is going to be filled with a lot of injustice and pain and hurt, but guess what? We're not made just for this world. We're on a mission here. And it can be a painful, unfair mission. But we serve a God that knows how to bring, a God that's out of this world that brings everything and puts in place that's in this world. And he's going to do that for us. I was praying one time about forgiveness. So you thought I got everything fixed all at once. I felt very betrayed by somebody, and I was praying about it. Went into my typical justifying mode until the Lord whispered to me, "When that person mistreats you as much as you've mistreated me, then you're free." Well, I realized that wasn't going to happen, so I might as well forgive. I'm convinced that the purest expression of love is made when it is not deserved. Therefore, I sometimes think in my own mind that forgiveness is the purest expression of love. Let's do it. Father, I don't know who needs what here, and I'm certainly not one to try to guilt trip somebody, but I hope we put somebody on the path of hope and forgiveness and freedom. If not now, perhaps in the future. We're just called to live like you live. We're called to forgive like you forgive. And so, Lord, thank you for helping me when I was failing and I was weak to bring me to a place of forgiveness. May I always be willing to live that way. May everyone here be willing to live that way. For, Lord, you are the one that matters. For me to live is you. Nothing else. Nothing that I want, nothing that I want to avoid. It's you. Thank you for forgiving us when we don't deserve it. Thank you for giving us the grace to forgive others. And thank you for those that have had the grace to forgive us. It's in Jesus' name that I pray this. Amen. You're dismissed.